you can still assign a code. It's called an unlisted procedure. If you have to apply an unlisted procedure code for a particular service that's performed, you have to send documentation along with it. So just keep that in mind. You have to support the application of that unlisted procedure code with documentation from the patient side. So after our Category 3 code is where our modifiers begin. And like I said, I think that there's probably 13 different appendices in this code manual. The first appendix is our modifiers. And again, we're going to be looking at modifiers next week. But again, those modifiers are used to append a particular code to say something was a little bit different. Perhaps 2 surgeons were required instead of 1. Perhaps we had to discontinue the surgery because something went wrong. Perhaps, we're still, because remember, we're resource-based, right? So if we've prepped, we've done this, we've done that, we're still using resources. And then if something changes, the healthcare organization or the provider would still be reimbursed. They would still be reimbursed because they started. They might not have finished what they started, but they started. They took those resources to begin the process. So they would still get reimbursed for that. When you have the reimbursement that's tied into all of this with the resource-based, there has to be a linkage between what was done and why it was done. So our ICD code is, of course, our why, right? And our CPT is the what. So when we look at modifiers next week, you will have an assignment next week where we'll be appending some of those modifiers. They can be a little tricky, and there's a lot of rules that apply to the use of modifiers. Next week, we're going to look at what they call the NCCI, which is the National Correct Coding Initiative. That's kind of similar to the CPT assistant, but what it does, it breaks it down by state, what's allowed and what's not allowed. Some durable medical equipment might not be covered here in the state of New Hampshire during a certain procedure. We'll look at that next week.
The modifiers, and this is all going to be,
yeah.
Like on the ICD code, I read chapter 1 today, and isn't the after the decimal point where the modifier goes on the ICD code? Is that what it is?
Well, for the ICD, what this is okay. I'm just giving you an example.
Yeah.
This is saying for this particular code, it's diabetes. And then the .03 is just specifying a little bit more. So it's bringing your code assignment to a higher level of specificity. And a modifier is appending to reach that same level of specificity.
Right.
But a modifier isn't used in ICD. It's only used in CPT.
Okay, I'm glad you specified that. Reading it, yeah.
Right.
And so in CPT, would we put additional numbers after the 5-digit, or would it still say 5 digits?
It would still be 5 digits.
Okay.
Sometimes just 3. If you can't code to that higher level, you stop where you are.
Okay.
The minimum number of digits for an ICD is 3. So if you can't, based on your documentation, if you can't bring it up to another level, you just stop, because you're coding to the highest level. So, yeah.
Professor Gunn, is it the state insurance departments that regulate which?
Absolutely, Dave. Absolutely. I gotta tell you right now that when you have these rules, every payer, and when I say a payer, I'm talking about a third-party payer, the largest third-party payer in the United States is Medicare. The US government is the largest. But for all of these other private health insurances, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Anthem, this, that, you've got quite a few different insurance providers out there, right? Everyone has a different rule. One thing that I used to do is I would take the most strictest, or the most stringent, and I would go by their guidelines. Because if I knew I was doing the harshest and most stringent, then I was kind of covering my bases across the board instead of trying to recall which accepts that, which doesn't accept that, which accepts this. I mean, you can always double check, but they all have their own set of rules. Each healthcare organization has a list. It's a coding compliance plan. Each healthcare organization, each provider should have one of these, but it breaks down what's acceptable and what isn't by insurance company. So it's a lot to kind of keep in place, but you figure the more times that you do something, the more familiar you become with it. I'm not sure if any of you, it's like I came up with the 250 code because I've seen that code so many times. When you start to become specialty specific, or you're in a certain healthcare organization, you start practicing the rules over day in and day out, they start to sink in. So it's not like you have to memorize everything, but that coding compliance plan is key.
The next question to that would be, understanding different companies have their own guidelines, what they require. What about, would a coder would be responsible for more than one state, or would?
Possibly, yes. Depending. If you have people that come and visit from out of state that may have an insurance carrier from a different state, the provider still wants to get paid, but you still need to follow the rules of that third-party payer, because you know something? They love to deny claims. They love to kick it back and say, oh, no, it's not coded the way we want it to. You're not getting paid. But, literally, they absolutely like to do that. And they like to make it harder for you. It's almost as though you got to go after that money. Or they're not just going to take it. They're not going to give you the easy answers. Has anybody ever called Medicare? Has anybody ever tried to navigate the Medicare website? It's actually gotten a lot better throughout the years, but has anybody tried navigating that? Like, holy cow. They do not make it easy. They do not make it easy. I know in reimbursement methods, you'll cover quite a bit of information and kind of do some steps in navigating that CMS website to become a little bit more familiar with some of the rules, regulations, and yeah.
And not everyone uses the 1500 form either.
No.
So.
Well, typically it's the 1500 form for the Medicare patients, yes, and the 1450, because they're CMS forms. CMS is the acronym for Center of Medicare Services. So, all right. Appendix B is a summary of the additions, deletions, and revisions. Does anybody know when they're coming out with CPT 5? When we're going to be implementing? They're not. They're not. Every year in January, any changes are incorporated right into the current version. So we're not going to have this huge implementation like ICD-10, because every year those changes are incorporated. They publish all of the changes right in the Appendix B so that you know what's been added, what's been deleted. All of that information is available. There's quite a few listed here in Appendix B. Because they continually update, they may have some codes that are out of sequenced because they don't change the publication, but they got to put them in somewhere. So that's why I was saying, you gotta train your eyes to look up, you gotta train your eyes to look down. Typically, there's a little note, but still, just be aware of that they may have kind of a resequenced code. So it might not be in the appropriate numerical order that you would expect, and it may be in a separate column, so just keep that in mind. Appendix C are those clinical examples that I mentioned about, they can be really helpful for learning, evaluation, and management coding, assigning those particular codes. They can be really helpful with that. Appendix E is a summary of the CPT add-on codes. There are some codes in this manual where when you apply it, it requires a specific add-on code to state that something was done during that particular procedure. It's noted when you get to that code. You do have a note saying must use add-on code such and such. So it is noted there when you have to use those. Appendix E is a summary of CPT codes that are exempt from Modifier 51. You know how I had mentioned that we have those NCCI edits and we have particular rules that apply to specific modifiers, and they can cause denial of a claim. So we do have specific codes that Modifier 51 does not apply to. And I know we haven't talked about Modifier 51. We will next week, and we'll take a look at this appendix again to see if we can understand the rationale as to why this particular modifier would not be appended to some of these codes. Appendix F, we've got a summary of the CPT codes that are exempt from Modifier 63. Appendix G, we have a summary of CPT codes that include moderate sedation. In CPT, sometimes they have what they call global or bundled payments, where they know that this procedure can't be performed unless the person is moderately sedated. So they group that resource or that payment right into that particular code. So rather than applying two codes, you know the person has to be sedated. They have the one code which includes sedation. That make sense? So if you have a code that includes that sedation, you're not going to use an anesthesia code on top of it, right? Because we'd be double code. It's almost like double dipping. That's exactly what we would be doing. Appendix H is a alphabetical clinical topics listed. Appendix I is genetic testing, code modifiers. Appendix J is actually, it lists out the electrodiagnostic medicine, the listing of the sensory, motoring, and mixed nerves. When you start to get into the different vessels and veins, and it can be a little bit tricky. So again, these resources help. Appendix K is product pending FDA approval. So of course these codes have not yet been approved by the FDA, so therefore they're not in the CPT manual. Appendix L lists all of the different vascular families. So when we start to look at the arterial and the vascular, again, these resources can be very helpful. Appendix M has all of the deleted CPT codes in the manual. Do you think they need any more appendices in this book? Yay. And then, Appendix N, we have a summary of our resequenced CPTs. Those are those CPTs where they're not in the exact order that you would think that they would be in numerically. Hey, Appendix O. This has some different assays that are performed with labs. One of the things that when we start to look at the laboratory services is number of the different tests of what they call panels. So when one specific test is performed, it covers a panel of testing. And then we get to the index. The very beginning of the index actually has some pretty good tips for using the CPT coding or the CPT index. Before we do that, what I'll do is, I got 2 more PowerPoints to pass out here. I'll be printing these each week too for you, so don't waste your ink. Has anyone ever coded or done the CPT coding out there in industry in here? No?
I check for ABNs.
Do you? Well, that's good. That's good. Yep. I'll give you the other codes.
Sorry.
That's okay.
My son's, I guess, a downward structural.
Okay. So the first one I'm just going to take a look at is we're going to go over using the CPT index. And I think in this first one, the CPT coding review, I had mentioned about the what and the why. Of course, the ICD explains the what, the CPT explains the why. So there's quite a bit of good information here that you'll want to review. You never, never, never code from the index. Just like ICD, you never code from the index. You always want to make sure when you select a particular code that you go in the main sections of the CPT to look at that descriptor a little bit more. A code range is where you have a range of codes. So in other words, if you go to the CPT index and you come up with a range of codes, it's somewhere in that range. You're not going to enter the range itself on the CMS 1500 form because that's going to come back at you. So again, you want to have those eyes moving up, moving down. We're going to take a look at one of the first things. Does everyone have their coding manuals with them? Most of you? So what is the code for PTCA? PTCA, I'm giving you an abbreviation.